At the front of the Gospels, you will typically see according to, and then Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. So this would at first sight tell us who wrote these texts, and the attributions to the authorship are right there. Even in the modern world, the primary way someone would know who authored a book is simply by looking at the front of a book. So in modern context, that is the cover. However, in the context of the Gospels, we have an attribution to authorship on the front of the Gospels themselves, which is going to be the titles. So given that the book itself just tells us who wrote it, why should we deny it when, until given sufficient reason to, we don't challenge self-proclaimed authorship? So for example, if you go to a store and you see a book and the title says it's by Joseph Ratzinger, let's say, you will trust that it's authored by him until shown otherwise, because we don't challenge attributions like that until we have evidence to the contrary. Similarly, if I see that the letter to the Romans begins with a greeting from Paul, indicating that he's the author, I'm inclined to believe that, and I would need strong evidence to the contrary in order to conclude that Paul didn't write it. So this is especially the case given the unanimous attestation external to the letter about his authorship. And as I mentioned above, the titles of the Gospels state that they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So it's clear which Matthew, which Mark, which Luke, and which John they refer to, given the evidence from the external tradition, but also from the fact that each of those names would, in the early church, only have one figure associated with that name that could have authored a Gospel. So although there would have been, for example, more than one Matthew in the church, it's completely unlikely that this other Matthew would have been authoritative or recognizable enough that they could write a gospel like Matthew's with the title Matthew, without ever clarifying that he's not the Apostle Matthew mentioned within the book. And the same with John. The fact that the gospel is just called according to John with no further disambiguation implies that this John had the ability to author an authoritative gospel that the church has accepted, while expecting people to just know who he was from the name alone and details in the text. So the only one who could have done this, it just seems, would be an apostle, which is what the gospel itself claims in the text as well. Furthermore, if the titles are original, then claiming the text is formally anonymous is misleading. So to clarify, formal anonymity refers to the lack of attribution to authorship within the text itself. This is distinct from the Gospels having unknown authors. The entirety of the early church, and even we can know that, for example, the Gospel of Matthew was written by Matthew, the apostle, and yet the text itself can't be formally anonymous because it doesn't mention who wrote it. Even scholars who believe that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels will usually concede that they are still anonymous in this formal sense. However, if the titles are original, then it doesn't seem accurate to refer to the text even as formally anonymous, because the title would be part of what the original author wrote. And thus, when we analyze whether the text is formally anonymous or not, we should include that in our analysis regardless. So thus, since the titles do tell us who wrote the text, it would mean that they will show that the Gospels are not even formally anonymous. And to be fair, this is more of an issue about our language and the connotations thereof. So the main issue I'm pointing out is that saying the Gospels are formally anonymous seems to be misleading if there's a title. For example, if an author were to write a book, we wouldn't call it formally anonymous just because they don't reference their name in the main body of the text, even though they have it on the cover or some of the first few pages. So it seems that the titles do allow us to know who wrote the Gospels. However, the biggest challenge to this offered in scholarship is to deny that the Gospels originally contained the titles and instead state they were added later on. However, there are good reasons to reject this account and instead say that the Gospels had their titles originally. For starters, when positing a scribal addition or redaction, the burden of proof is always upon the one positing the redaction and the addition. For example, if someone claimed that John 3:16 was a later addition, it will be their burden to prove it happened. Thus, it's the burden of the one who posits the titles are added to prove it is the case. However, there is no such good positive evidence for the claim that the Gospels were ever without their title. In fact, the suggestion that they were is essentially just conjecture with nothing behind it. For instance, Martin Hengel points out that nobody during his time ever gave any positive evidence for the Gospels being anonymous, and Robert Gundry wrote that no positive evidence exists for the claim that the Gospels circulated without their titles. Not much, it seems, has changed since then, as there is still no good positive evidence for the Gospels originally not having titles. As Peter writes, the anonymous Gospel theory is almost completely baseless. It has no foundation in the earliest manuscripts of the Gospels. It fails to take seriously how ancient books were copied and circulated, and it suffers from an overall lack of historical plausibility. Furthermore, Wegener notes that wealth of New Testament manuscripts allow us to conclude that there is no original reading of the New Testament, which isn't recorded somewhere in the manuscript tradition. This is important because we have no manuscript evidence that even one of the Gospels did not have attributions to authorship, let alone all four. This is simply just not attested in the manuscript tradition, and as Wegener points out, it is highly unlikely that the conjectural emendation, a reading that is not supported by any textual evidence, would ever be necessary to reconstruct the original text. Secondly, we have examples of titles being affixed later to other works, which allow us to determine the historical context and to know what would happen in the case of titles being added later on and our Gospels do not fit that context. Select works by Galen and the Epistle to the Hebrews did not have the titles attributing to authorship originally, and this caused those works to actually receive a variety of different titles and attributions. In the case of Hebrews, due to lack of explicit attribution to authorship, we see debates. Hengel also cites Josephus, Plato, and Aristotle to show that works without titles easily got double or multiple titles when names were given to them in different libraries. On the contrary, we see no such variance with the Gospels where different authors are assigned to the same book using titles. For example, there's no copy of Matthew attributed to Peter. Third, given that the Gospels do not explicitly state their name, minus the title, in the text, the titles would have been a practical necessity for the original authors. As Gathercole points out, the earliest Christians, upon receiving the Gospel and reading about Jesus, would have likely asked, "Says who?" This is a common sense speculation which we should expect anyone to ask. I would find it unlikely that they would just accept these books without any form of title attributing to its authorship. So this would make it a practical necessity for the authors to include a title, and the fact that their Gospels were accepted would also indicate that they did include a title. So this is especially the case when we look at who specifically accepted the Gospels. It's widely known in scholarship that two of the synoptic Gospels are dependent upon the first synoptic Gospel chronologically, with the most prominent view being that Matthew and Luke are dependent upon Mark. Gathercole writes, Matthew and Luke, for all their sense that Mark needed adaptation and expansion, followed Mark so closely in order and content because they had received reports about it which inspired some confidence. Minimally, this is likely to have been a name. It is one thing to assume that Christians in a first century congregation would simply have taken on trust or what they had read out without asking the says who question. It's a considerable step beyond that, and beyond what I at least can believe, to suppose that a professedly conscientious investigator like Luke would, without any accompanying testimony followed by ancient standards extraordinary closely, a naked anonymous account. It seems far more likely that Luke and Matthew would have received, alongside Mark's Gospel, some statement, oral or paratextual, about what and whose it was. The first readers and audience of Mark's Gospel would have known who wrote it, and the distance in time between Mark and his synoptic successors was not that very great. Mark is rarely considered to be much more than about 15 years earlier than Matthew and Luke. As we saw Walter noting earlier, it's not the case that the author wished to remain unknown. There is no evidence for a desire for secrecy. Gathercole's point also applies to later Christians such as Polycarp, who was said to directly know the apostles and only taught what they taught. Why would we expect these Christians to accept anonymous Gospels? Fourth, in Christian worship communities, books needed a title because when books were read out loud, the congregation would say the title of the book, as Gathercole says. Given that the Gospels were obviously used by Christians in their communities, it would be the case that the Gospels would have required a title very early on. We should also expect the original authors to know about this, given that they were part of these communities, and thus the title likely goes back to the original author, even if due to pure necessity. Fifth, to add on to the fourth point, Gathercole does state the title, the Gospel, would be sufficient to distinguish a Gospel from other books. However, this is only the case in the scenario that one Gospel existed in a community. This context likely only occurred with at most two Gospels, given that it's obvious that two of the synoptics are dependent upon another synoptic. That would only leave out one synoptic, and the Gospel of John as being independent. In the case of the literally dependent Gospels, the title would still be necessary even for an author to affix, and yet simply the title, the Gospel, would not work as a title because it could not distinguish them from one another. For example, if Matthew came first, then Mark and Luke used Matthew. Mark and Luke would need titles distinct from Matthew's title. Even in the case of John, given that books and information spread quickly via the network of the church, it is likely that the author of John, writing well after the synoptic authors, would have known about the other Gospels, and thus would have seen it fit to add a title which would be able to distinguish himself from the other three. Given the considerations of 4 and 5, we can say that at least 3 of the original Gospel authors affixed the title themselves, which distinguished themselves from the other Gospels. The best candidate to what this was would be the titles we see in the manuscript tradition, as we have no evidence to the contrary. Furthermore, even for the one Gospel that was potentially in isolation, it would be unlikely for them to name their text the Gospel rather than the Gospel according to. Firstly, because of the considerations above in points 1 to 4 and below in points 6 to 7, specifically suggesting the first Gospel to be produced had a title other than what we have today is just ad hoc and has no evidence. However, given that Christians produced a large amount of texts about Jesus early on, we would expect that the author of the first Gospel to be produced would anticipate more Gospels to arise, and thus simply naming the text the Gospel doesn't seem to be adequate, as it doesn't leave space open for the other texts. This is especially the case if we take the Mark in priority, because Mark seems to be too short and simplified for Mark not to anticipate a second Gospel. Sixth, Hengel writes that anonymity in terms of attribution within a text is not to be expected when looking at Christian works. That would be the exception, not the norm, and thus he concludes, as a rule, people no longer published or had multiple copies made anonymously. For example, Paul's letters, Revelation, etc. all have titles or some form of internal attribution of authorship. Therefore, we should expect to see titles on the Gospels to explain who authored it. Thus, this supports the view that the titles are original. This is not to say that all works must have an attribution to authorship somewhere, just that it's the norm that they would. Furthermore, it would be very surprising if this norm was violated not just once, but 4 times in the case of the Gospels. Seventh, we see a unanimity of titles in all of our manuscripts. Hengel points out that there is unanimity in the titles all the way at the end of the 2nd century, and that this unanimity came about across a large geographical range. If the titles were not there from the very beginning, or at least from very early on, since the original circulation of the Gospels, then how did this occur? There was no central authority in early Christianity to just cause everyone to affix a title to one text without leaving a trace behind, let alone 4 texts. This can't be ignored. There was simply no authority in early Christianity who could just cause all of the manuscripts to be altered to add a title. It's highly unlikely that this happened to one major Christian text without leaving a trace, let alone 4.